Thanks so much, Anna. Steve, welcome. Great to see you again.
Yeah, glad to be here. Looking forward to it. We have a lot to go through today.
Yes, we do. And folks on the line, as Anna mentioned, please use the Q&A if you have any questions. We're going to be watching that closely. If you see me looking away from my camera, it is because I'm using a widescreen and just trying to follow that and follow Steve. But we're really excited to talk to all of you today. We've got some data from our 2024 CISO compensation and budget survey where we had more than 850 CISOs respond. We are going to be talking through our findings specifically relating to how the CISO role is evolving, how expectations are changing, and what that means you should think about your personal career evolution in 2025 and how you're shaping your program goals. Steve, anything you want to add at a high level?
Yeah, looking forward to this. I've been serving on the IDES faculty for several years now, and the data in this report is our, I think, fifth iteration of going out with the CISO comp and budget study. So looking forward to diving into some of the details.
Great. So Steve is a faculty member and a partner at Artico Search's cyber practice. We work closely with Artico on this research because it gives us a chance to blend data that we're getting on the IAN side of the community and from the wider InfoSec community with market expertise that Steve is seeing as they're hiring and placing CISOs and other security executives in different roles. It gives us a chance to really have a pretty nuanced and unique perspective on the breadth of the industry. And today we want to go through some of that data to help you really think about what is changing for CISOs, what trends are becoming more normative in the industry, and how can you think about positioning yourself to achieve your personal goals, but also to really drive your program forward in the coming year. We're going to talk through really four key areas. First, how scope is changing and escalating for CISOs. Then the resulting situation in which CISOs are getting elevated in the org into more of an executive role than they've been into the past. We're seeing that trend accelerate heading into 2025. And then as a result, the opportunities that are starting to emerge for CISOs, focusing a little bit on dual IT and security roles in which CISOs are taking on more ownership of IT. And then we're going to round it out by talking about setting yourself up for future opportunities as we are seeing a growing conversation in the industry of folks questioning the CISO as kind of a terminal role in the career. For a lot of people, CISO was kind of where you got to as the top of the security career and where it ended, but we are seeing more and more folks looking for other opportunities, and we want to spend some time there and also a little bit on just more immediate short-term planning. Steve, before we kick it off, any last words?
No, let's dive right into it.
All right, folks, we're going to keep this very conversational, so feel free to use the Q&A. Let us know where you want us to zoom in. We're going to spend time there. All right, so first off, scope increases are escalating. We are seeing CISOs getting pulled into a wider range of tasks with InfoSec kind of as the trunk of the tree. We are seeing branches off into business risk, broader security, IT, and digital strategy. In general, this is coming from a similar central theme in which all of these aspects of the business are more digital. Data related risk is more prominent in all of these segments of the business, and CISOs are just the best people to problem solve. We talk about issues like AI. There are a few folks in the org who have the blend of technical knowledge, regulatory knowledge, and business knowledge to really think about AI risk, and it's leading to a situation where CISOs are naturally and organically getting pulled into a wider range of business conversations. Steve, how is this playing out in terms of the skill set that folks are looking for in CISOs and the skills CISOs need to be building to be successful?
Yeah, so if we think about security as a journey from a career perspective, things really changed 10 years ago, and we're probably 10 years into a 30-year transformation for security and security leadership. Before, it was more of a back office function, as we know, not interfacing with senior leaders necessarily, not interfacing with the board. Over the course of time, as Nick said, you all possess a skill set that is a combination of technical and I think ideally business sense as well, which is where most of the market is going, and therefore being given more and more scope. So the blessing of that is more visibility, sometimes more compensation, more opportunities, more ability to grow your brand both internally and externally. And some of the challenges are that you may not have a team that's keeping up with that. You may not have a comp package that's keeping up with that. It may turn into more of a catch-all type role, and it's, oh gosh, I'm constantly solving problems and I can never really get ahead with anything. So this is what we're seeing contextually. This is why we also see significant movement. Typically, 2024 was somewhat of an exception, but we see that security tenures continue to be less than some peers in both tech leadership and broad C-suite leadership at large.
Great. And I'm seeing some questions in the Q&A. I'm going to get to those in just a second. Love the input though, folks. Keep it coming. Steve, one quick follow-up before we go to the Q&A. As this evolution continues to happen, how are you seeing the CISOs who are living it really differentiate themselves in the marketplace as new roles emerge where businesses are asking for this broader skill set?
We exist right now in an environment where most CISOs, 70% plus, have come up through the organization on the technical side, but the demands with the broadening of scope and the increase in visibility is very much about executive and business skills. So we find that there are many CISOs out there who have been trained for a job to a certain point, but once you get to that senior director, VP level, typically by VP or higher, it changes quite a bit. And the technical skills, while still important from a foundational standpoint, become less important in terms of communication, in terms of relationship building, in terms of change management and transformation initiatives. And so it's a challenging environment, which is why we do the survey, which is why we offer these webinars to help give some actionable insights to help you navigate some of these challenges, many of which maybe 4 or 5 years ago were not even on your radar.
Yeah, and this actually segues really nicely into JR's question in the chat. Does this dynamic create a situation where something like an MBA is more valuable for CISOs today than it might have been 4 or 5 years ago? And then how would
I
you describe that value?
Yeah, I think it's certainly helpful. Nobody ever didn't get a job because they had an MBA or didn't get a promotion because they had an MBA. At the same time, I think that managing your own reputation internally, being viewed with the right peer cohort, being viewed in the same lens when you speak in the boardroom as a general counsel, a CFO, a business leader, a product leader is really important. And externally, not to get too bogged down in what's happening outside the four walls, but picking up strategic partnerships and strategic speaking slots to stay relevant in the industry. So there you are viewed as a thought leader in the space, a strong operational partner internally at security, but somebody who can think about big problems and help solve big problems. So the answer is you don't need an MBA to go upstream. It won't hurt, but one of the things, one of the value that Eins has and what we're trying to break through is there's not enough time in the day to do all of this. So throwing on top of it an advanced executive MBA program or something like that can be really difficult. So we recognize that, and I think that organizations recognize that. You don't necessarily need to tick that box, provided that you can talk a business language and you're viewed in the organization as a true business leader.
And I'm going to try to get kind of two questions that we're seeing at once. We've got multiple questions about D&O insurance, both for private orgs, but also CISOs going past D&O requests to right of legal defense. Let's just kind of talk a little bit more broadly, even as these expectations increase for CISOs and CISOs have a wider breadth of things that they have some ownership of. How are you seeing CISOs protect themselves from liability and manage the responsibility burden that comes with that?
I'm encouraged by the question because I think 3 or 4 years ago we would have brought it up and it wouldn't have been brought up organically. I think that we're still pretty far from an equilibrium of what it looks like as far as being included in an offer, having D&O protection or indemnification, or whatever the case may be. We see different companies think about this in a different way, but as more and more candidates demand this to make a job move, then we will find that this is just table stakes for everybody. I wouldn't think about this as a perk or part of, well, we're flexing to give you the D&O coverage. That should just be table stakes at this point. But there are many organizations out there, including very large scale enterprises, that they say, well, we just did a chief product officer search or we just did a general manager search and this didn't come up. And so we as the community, us as recruiters, and then you as practitioners, the burden is on us to educate companies to say, well, this is different and here's why. We could call back to different cases where individuals are named. We can call back different cases that got into litigation. But I think that we see that there are different organizations that address this in a different way. So understanding what you require to take on a new job or what you're looking for in your current job to ensure that there's some level of alignment and getting in front of that as best you can, recognizing that there are going to be companies that hear that story, understand it, and they make it right. And there are going to be companies that hear it, they don't really get it, and therefore they're not going to move. I think one of the challenges over the past year or two has been, well, this person is asking for this, but maybe candidate B is not. If candidate B, C, and D are all asking for it, then that just becomes the way that we structure new packages, which is really important and where we need to strive to go.
Yeah, we've got a few more questions I want to get to, but first I want to zoom in on how this scope creep looks. What we are seeing on the whole, I want to kind of walk you through how to read this chart. The far left column are things that we are seeing universally. CISOs have some element of ownership of, with 90% plus CISOs having some ownership of those functions. To the right of things that they have some level of ownership of, but we're seeing down to the emerging areas where 1 to 25% of CISOs have that. We are seeing both broadening in terms of more business functions that CISOs have some ownership of, but then also deepening more traditional InfoSec or tech functions that CISOs are gaining ownership of. As this breadth increases, the importance of continued growth, continued skill development, getting exposure to more diverse parts of the business becomes critical, but that doesn't necessarily mean more certifications or more formalized training. Steve, can you kind of walk through how you're seeing the successful CISOs who are really differentiating themselves gain some of these areas of expertise in a way that's demonstrable without necessarily going into like the formal certification path, which doesn't always work as well with business executive audiences?
Yeah, it's all foundational in that you have to be a really good security leader before you become a really good broad tech leader, and you have to be a broad technical functional leader before you think about being a business leader because that's your area of expertise. So my advice to people is typically you want to be viewed in the organization as a business risk executive with a specialization in cybersecurity, and you want to be that go-to person. So whether it's an AI initiative, whether it's M&A activity, whether it's business strategy and thinking about different platforms or different migrations or whatever the case may be, are people viewing you and going to you to solve business problems with your focus in security and in technology broadly? That's really the difference, and that's the evolution that we see, and that matches the scope creep that we see as well when we talk about digitalization efforts, when we talk about strategic efforts, when we talk about the convergence of broader IT and security, just in total. There has to be a foundation there, and you have to build on that foundation. And CISO's tough. If you meet a CFO, you probably know what their scope is. You probably know what their reporting is. You probably know that they talk to the board. If you meet a CISO, I mean, that could really be somebody who's leading a team of one and spending most of their time coding and maybe working with product teams. That could be somebody who doesn't know how to code, never knew how to code, but is working at a really large enterprise and driving the strategic direction of security. There is a Fortune 50 oil and gas company that has a CISO who's been in the seat about 18 months, and that person does not have a security background at all. That's a business transformation person, and there are challenges to that and positives to that. But thinking about where the evolution of this function is going and how you position yourself to help get you to achieve what you'd like to achieve over time.
Yeah, and so in that vein, we are seeing things like the NICD certifications and other certifications emerging as prominent, valuable options. But we also would caution to really think about what's going to give you the most bang for your time. What we constantly hear from the community is the busyness, the need to find balance, the need to get more exposed to strategic parts of the business and find time to get involved in those things. And sometimes those kinds of external certifications can be hugely valuable because you're doing them outside of your work time and you're finding balance. But sometimes it's going to be more valuable to delegate more core tasks to your team members and get involved in a cross-functional product or project that's going to get you direct exposure to lines of business that you otherwise wouldn't experience. And it's going to be really a very personalized decision. There isn't necessarily a single best practice pathway that's emerging in the industry. Steve, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I would also recognize that we have a contingent of CISOs that have been trained for one job, but then it's not really the skill set that will help you advance to that emerging top percentage, right? And so thinking about what you could do to fill those gaps, and I think that there's a twofold challenge here. One is that CISOs need to up their game to be more business focused and spend time on personal and professional development in that area. Not always easy considering the time constraints. But two, you need a senior leadership team and a board that is giving you the resources and the allocation to be able to put that time in. And that's often where the gap is as well. I would love to go do an NACD class, but I'm not getting sponsorship. I would love to talk more to the board, but I've been explicitly told that I can't talk to the board. And these are the challenges that I think will unstick themselves over time, but it's not going to happen overnight. And so we all have to be advocates for these important topics. But if we're not doing it in a business-centric way, if we're not speaking the same language as the rest of the senior leadership team and the board of directors and talking about business strategy, then that gap will persist.
And let's talk about that resource situation a little bit as we get into this. One of the first questions we got in the chat was, as scope expands, our security budgets expanding along with it? What we are seeing in our budget data is that security budgets are continuing to grow, but at a declining rate from what we've seen coming out of the pandemic in the past few years of the early 2020s. In general, we are hearing more and more from CISOs that they are having to fight a lot for budget, not in a security isn't a priority, nobody cares kind of way, but more in a security is just one of the parts of the business and everybody in the business is fighting for budget. And what we are hearing, we had a really great conversation with IANS faculty member Aaron Turner the other day, talking about vendor prices really escalating at a rate that's faster than security budgets escalating. And as folks are dealing with consolidating into point versus platform solutions and making those decisions, more and more CISOs are actually turning to line of business owners to say like, hey, can we share cost for our Microsoft E5 license or for our Palo Alto license because they're going to help your business unit achieve certain goals. And we're seeing CISOs looking for creative solutions to stretch out budget resources more so than getting budget resources to help. They are saying, hey, we're helping you own this function that really sits under your line of business. Can you help us with the costs? Steve, anything you want to elaborate on there?
Yeah, well, I think most CISOs are being asked to do more with less. The scope continues to increase more than you can hire or sometimes find tools for, or find people to properly administer those tools to get the most out of them. And I think that over the last 12 to 18 months, there's also been fairly low levels of attrition compared to previous years. And so organizations are saying, well, my team, this security team has the lowest attrition rates we've seen since the pandemic. So how unhappy could people be? And I think when you dig into things, it's, well, they may be quite unhappy. There just may not be the opportune position that they're jumping to amidst some of the macro instability that we've seen over the past 12 months.
Yeah, one more question I want to get to before we head into the next segment, because it's actually something we don't cover later. As all of this has changed for CISO expectations, how are you seeing reporting lines change?
It's predominantly still through tech. It's predominantly still through CIO and CTO. Although with that convergence, you end up with a director or VP of IT that's doing more of the operational work, some of the strategic work on IT, reporting up to a CIO slash CISO. We are seeing more of that, and it's not necessarily at smaller companies. I could think of a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical company where their CISO is still CISO in title, but also leading IT and also leading digitalization efforts. The compensation may or may not keep pace with that, so that's something to think about as you are asked to take on more strategic roles, and you can leverage our data to go in and advocate for yourself to say, well, if I'm taking on this, that, and the other, then that should come with a premium as well. But I think that the role continues to evolve, and so being an advocate for yourself is really important, and taking third-party data out there to be able to say, look, here are third parties that are validating what my perspective is. Let's try to work through something that makes sense for all parties.
Yeah. All right, let's get a little bit.
I also want to address Sean Malone in the chat mentioned that about 60% of what he does is actually written in his job description, and I think that's true for a lot of people. And there are startups out there, and we'll do a spec for a startup. I'm working on a search right now, and they said the spec probably represents 75% of what this person is doing, but we're all moving really quickly. We're hyperscaling. We're expecting to double our business this year. There's going to be 20% that we're not even thinking of that's going to be in this job spec and what this person will be doing on a day-to-day basis. And my best advice is reevaluate that job spec and make sure that you know what your scope of responsibility is, even as it changes. It's a great time to do during a yearly review, for example, where you could say, okay, here is my original job description. Here's my amended job description, and just get aligned on that because that may help protect you, and you can also help manage your personal and professional liability by saying this is in scope for me, this is not. And if it's something written down that you're doing on a daily basis and you're responsible for strategic direction and operational excellence, make sure the organization knows that because then if something goes awry, you don't want any finger pointing or anything like that. It's like, yes, that was clearly in my scope. No, that clearly was not. And so there's an opportunity there, particularly this time of year when I think a lot of people are doing some of those reviews. It's a good opportunity to reevaluate what you were brought in to do versus what you're doing on a daily basis.
And it's also a natural time to start elevating these conversations around board communications. Steve, we do have a question in here, and I want to kind of touch on it right now around what to do when your org wants to be delivering value and believes it can be delivering value, but you're not getting access to the board. How do you recommend folks kind of start influencing at the executive level to demonstrate that value so that others can see it and then help to elevate the CISO role? We'll talk about this in a little bit more detail later, but can we start here?
Yeah. So there's two things at play here. One is introspection of, am I telling the right story that will resonate with the business leaders of the organization and make sure that you have that buttoned up? because that without that, you're never going to elevate to that point. Okay, tick that off. You do that. That's good. So you have your pitch. You know what you want to say. You know what you want to get in front of the board and need their help with. And now it's finding advocates at the C-suite level and going to people and saying, how do I break through? Here's the messaging that I want to say. Can you help me refine it? Am I on the right track? And I think that as you recognize champions in the organization for you and your program, those opportunities eventually will come to you. Now, there are going to be organizations that just you do all of that, you do everything right, and it just doesn't work. And then you have to be honest with yourself. Am I along for this platform? Is this the right fit for me? Or do I need to think about something different where maybe I'm getting the level of visibility that I really want? This will depend on ownership structure. This will depend on company culture. This will depend on who your CEO is, even in some cases. And so there has to be a match of and an alignment of how much access do you want, do you need, do you really feel compelled for your personal brand, and is your organization properly situated, leadership properly situated to be able to advance that?
Perfect. And we see this, as we talk about CISOs getting elevated in the org, we are seeing CISOs often fall into one of three groups. And I want to be really careful as we talk about this to clarify something. This is more about how we see the organization perceiving the CISO and putting boundaries around the CISO role, not necessarily the capabilities of any given CISO or cohort of CISOs, but we see kind of three groups emerging. First is the kind of the tactical CISOs. These are folks who the org is largely asking to serve as a technical leader, keep all the lights on, keep the attackers out, make sure the company stays secure, and kind of leave it at that, a much more traditional way of looking at the CISO role. Folks who are being asked to serve more as functional CISOs, as we're calling it in this case, are really working to align with the business. They get some exposure to the board, some exposure to the C-suite, but not as much as the folks in the strategic category. And they are kind of hearing from the business what the business needs from security in terms of managing risk. They are connecting to leaders and kind of actively seeking that feedback, and they are working to align to the business. And then we are seeing strategic CISOs, and these are folks who have regular access to the board, regular access to the C-suite, and they are functioning predominantly as business executives who are overseeing the security function, and they are delegating a lot of their tactical tasks to their leaders. Let's spend a little bit of time on what each of these cohorts look like. So it's tactical CISOs made up about 22% of our sample. When we say the industries that we see them in, this is not exclusive. This is just most commonly the industries that tactical folks are in: legal, manufacturing, and education. Looking at size by market cap, you can kind of read that yourself. What I want to really emphasize is we are seeing a lot of folks who are in this group who are working to become really strong leaders, who are starting to think about security as a value for the business and are building those executive skills and are getting frustrated trying to kind of break through the wall of a business that is putting them into this more tactical box. Steve, you just talked a little bit about how to get out of that box and break that exposure. What are you seeing in terms of movement in the market for folks who have kind of been in this box for a long time, trying to get into new roles? What's your advice to them?
So this is a great opportunity to talk about career progression and development where you don't necessarily have to go from CISO at the middle market, unregulated organization that views the role tactically to another one that's at a higher scale. You could think about your career development in terms of what would be the trajectory of your career 2 moves from now if you were to look at number two jobs under a strategic CISO under the guidance and tutelage of somebody who that we view as a top 5% CISO in terms of strategic acumen, the way that the market views them, the way that their company views them. Maybe there's opportunity for succession in that organization, but even beyond that, how do you position yourself for the next job and where do you want to take your career over the next, call it 5 to 6 years, rather than just the next 24 to 36 months? And so it doesn't necessarily have to be full stack security leadership at one of these types of companies today, which, as you can tell from this, right, there are specific industries that jump out: medium size, smaller size, privately held, so non-public companies. Some get it, many don't. And so when you're also thinking about where the organization is going, try to suss out, okay, if I am talking to a company in one of these sectors and they do tick a number of these boxes from a demographic standpoint, why is the role open? How are they viewing it? What are the expectations for when I go into it? Because then you could also suss out, okay, we call it tactical CISO, but it's really a company viewing security in a tactical way. So how is that company pivoting from what they were before or staying the same from what they were before, connecting the dots, talking to people who have worked there, maybe leveraging your network to find out people who have been senior leaders in security at that organization to figure out what's actually going on the ground there. Have they always said that they're committed to elevating the role, but then it doesn't happen? Or is this really different? And why is this really different?
Yeah, and this also kind of might segue a little bit into some questions we're seeing around how is the evolution of the CISO role leading into shifts in perception and value for folks who are in roles like the BISO role or a deputy CISO role. If you're talking to someone who's kind of feeling stuck in a tactical CISO role, who really gets the business, would a BISO role be a natural transition for them? Would going somewhere and becoming a head of architecture and deputy CISO be a natural transition for someone who's maybe more technically architecturally minded and wants to move in that direction and specialize? How do you see those roles as opportunities for the CISO, for folks who want to become CISOs, but also how do you see those roles changing as the CISO has more on their plate?
Well, I think, and this goes to, there were some questions in the chat about deputy CISOs. And I think historically, we have seen deputy CISOs not get the nod for promotion. We've seen it on occasion, but more often than not, an organization will go out, they'll do a search, they'll benchmark those in the market versus the people internally. And many times they'll say, oh, well, this person had the title, and so we think that they're a better fit. And then it's, well, what do I do? I've never had the title before. And so you have to navigate these different challenges and figure out which ways to go. If you are a sitting CISO at one of these organizations, you've already done it. I think it's thinking holistically about your career and coming up with a diverse set of experience. Have you done this? Have you ticked the scale box and worked for a really large enterprise? Have you led technical teams? Have you led governance teams? Have you led specific initiatives like a FedRAMP certification or a digital transformation or a change in an ERP system from a security perspective? Things like this. All of those pieces fit into your toolkit and make you more marketable for the next role, make you more marketable for the right next role. And really being thoughtful about what you're pursuing and why. And my advice when I talk to people is, what are you a differentiated candidate for, and how do you go pursue those opportunities? Because you should go after stretch jobs occasionally as well. But if you're constantly going after that, it's going to get pretty frustrated because even if you do get a look, you're probably going to end up in second or third place every time, and you're going to wonder why. Go after the jobs that you are a top 10 candidate in the market for because of these 5 or 6 reasons, and be really thoughtful about that.
Right, let's shift over and talk about the group that we have labeled as functional CISOs. Again, these are folks that's more about the label that the businesses put on them than the CISOs themselves. We saw this being about 50% of our sample, which in some ways is encouraging. I think if we did this survey a few years ago with this set of questions, we probably would have been putting more like 50% in the tactical
Yeah.
roles. We are seeing these folks in industries like healthcare, retail, consumer goods, larger orgs. And we are seeing more and more folks where they are getting some exposure to the C-suite, some exposure to the board. We'll get into some of the details later, but we see around 50% of folks have access to the board either quarterly or monthly across our sample. It's becoming more commonplace in the industry. There's some real progress and elevation of CISOs happening. But we also see folks at this level hitting a bit of a wall where they're getting the chance to kind of dabble with the rest of the C-suite, but are still not considered peers of the C-suite. Steve, what is your advice for folks who are kind of in that role where they're kind of being perceived as aligned to the business, but not delivering value? How do they break out of that?
Yeah, I think one is try to elevate. These companies can go either way, right? They could stay where they are and they view the role functionally and they view the function of security within the silo of IT. And that's always what they're going to be. And you may be a valued leader of that organization, but that's all that organization is going to be. So evaluating your company and evaluating the leadership and really seeing what their appetite is. Do they really want a strategic CISO? They may claim that they do, but do their actions show that they are? Are you getting more opportunity in front of the board? Are you viewed with your peer group? Again, common themes here. I want to point out something that can help elevate this. When Aman in the chat asked about how you talk about budgets, and I think many CISOs are inclined to talk about how security can avoid revenue loss or avoid impactful events from a business continuity perspective. And sometimes maybe talk about contributing to revenue and profits. But I would almost turn that on its head and say, what's happening at a quarterly business review? What's happening at a strategic C-suite offsite that you're hopefully invited to? Or what's happening in the annual report or in quarterly earnings calls that really have security implications to them? And marrying those security implications to what's happening strategically with the business. And that's the best way to elevate to the strategic. So it's look, security never goes first in a board meeting, right? I've never heard of that happening. Usually it goes toward the end of the day and the time gets smaller and smaller as it goes and the day gets longer. It's, hey, we talked about these 3 or 4 strategic initiatives the entire day. Let's talk about the security implications of that and whether we're on track to achieve or we need more help and why. That is very easy to understand language. It's marrying what you're doing functionally to the business goals. And at the end of the day, you're not going to have a board member or C-suite leader say, well, that's just a silo of security. If you're actually tailing it to something that's happening and using those tailwinds to accelerate your program by connecting it to what's happening where Wall Street's concerned, investors are concerned, leadership's concerned, the board is concerned, that's a really helpful way to do it.
Yeah, and in that vein, we are seeing more CISOs using that to get recognized as strategic CISOs by the business, and businesses starting to really ask for more from the CISOs as business leaders. We're seeing this as being about 28% of our cohort. It is most common in banking, fintech, and tech and large orgs, as you would expect. But we are seeing within this group a real nuance in which it is becoming especially critical for CISOs who are regarded as strategic to build closer relationships within their peer group, as for a long time coming up through security, those folks don't get exposed to other business leaders in the same way that, say, a VP of sales or a VP of marketing would. And when CISOs get into that C-suite and kind of get ushered in as a strategic CISO, they don't necessarily have the pre-existing relationship with a CFO or a pre-existing relationship with a COO that some of the other executives had. And investing in those relationships becomes particularly critical in delivering value in these roles. Steve, can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, you could be as strategic as they come in security. There's no President's Club outing in Mexico for you to go to. It's just not a thing, right? And so being viewed with that peer group and driving relationships with that peer group. So find the champions in the organization who are functional leaders and viewed as the movers and shakers. Most organizations, particularly public companies, have 2 or 3 people who have the ear of the CEO and are very well respected. Many of them are longer tenured in the organization. Go to them and start to forge that relationship. You could use things like at the beginning, Anna talked about the daily dive. And it may sound simple, but who's not talking about DeepSeek this week? Having a perspective on that, something unique, something different, something moderating, hopefully, differentiated content that you could just share in a casual way with people who you want to be your advocates and people who can be your eyes and ears in a room when you're not invited to something. And I think that keeping that company will help, again, elevate your brand and have the organization start viewing you differently.
By the way, folks, we have a special briefing on DeepSeek tomorrow. If you're looking to figure out how to talk about that at the executive level, we've got Jake Williams and Summer Fowler coming to talk about that. But it's very true, like being able to talk about the issues that are in the business papers, that are on the business headlines, becomes really critical to build that peer group. And we have an interesting question in here on that kind of technical, functional, strategic split. What activities are different from tier to tier? We don't cover that in this research report, largely because we divided these tiers based on what we saw in the data, where the strategic folks are the folks who have regular access to the board and the C-suite. The functional folks have some access, and the tactical folks have minimal access. But if you look into our executive competencies research report that we did a few years back, we see some trends. We call it at that time between folks who are kind of doing back office security work and functional leaders, folks who are business aligned, folks who are business first, and folks who are agile. And we differentiate some of those functions in that way. You can get some more details there. But Steve, can you just talk kind of at a high level what you're seeing in the marketplace in terms of job expectations that are different for these various tiers?
Yeah, I think anecdotally, it's how are you spending your time? Are you spending your time in the technical weeds? Are you spending your time with technical teams? Are you spending your time solving technical challenges in just with your teams, or are you actually getting out of the security silo and even the IT vertical and going out and evangelizing the program, educating on the program, and coming up with different strategic solutions? So if you look at your day to day, how much time are you spending in this, that, or the other area? And it's not necessarily internal versus external, because there are what I would call functional level CISOs who are doing a lot of customer calls, but they still don't have the strategic impact or the ear that maybe a chief product officer does at some of those companies, or a general manager or CFO.
Yeah. I also want to get to this question. For those of us who had the business experience first, do you have tips on marketing the business experience without being shameless about it?
Well, I think it's you that's good. And I also think that it still needs to be, I have the major in cybersecurity. So I'm the business focused leader with the major in cybersecurity. So if you could talk the business language and that comes naturally, then to some extent you're ahead of the game. But then what you're going to need to do is be credible with those product teams, be credible with that security team, be credible across the organization if it's a more technically engineering centric organization. And I think again, it's finding the right company and the right culture for you. I would say that somebody who's come up through GRC and spent most of their time on the business risk side, maybe they are a financial auditor turned tech auditor turned security professional, maybe an engineering centric, developer centric organization is not necessarily the right fit. Because you'll never break through because it's, well, this person doesn't have the bona fides of some others in the organization, and that may lead to resentment and can lead to problems. We've seen that happen before. So be really strategic about where you are and where you're going in terms of company fit and company culture, because even if the job on paper looks good, who are you interviewing with even? If you're spending time with the head of engineering and the design team and in an interview process, that tells you something about a company. If you're spending time talking to the CFO, the general counsel, the head of product, that tells you something else about the company. So thinking about what signals you can pick up even in an interviewing cycle.
Yeah, and let's shift into a little bit of time, and we'll come back to these conversations as we get further on. Um, what these changes are leading to in terms of opportunities for CISOs, and specifically around changes in compensation. What we see is the pay bump between strategic, functional, and tactical is very clear in terms of both median cash compensation, but also then access to equity and bonuses. Steve, how do you advise folks who are looking to kind of jump between brackets to make those changes and kind of position themselves to get the rewards that are commensurate with the scope that they're actually working with?
Yeah, I think that we also clearly see that there is a relationship between, like we said before, strategic and some of the larger scale enterprises that are more regulated with more regulatory scrutiny, complicated businesses that are global businesses, global regulations, et cetera. I think that recognizing where does your organization fit in terms of visibility, and that will give you a sense of the compensation as well. We also see in our data, we talked about the number two thing. You can go and be a deputy somewhere, not necessarily deputy in name, but you could lead a pillar of security and make more than the average CISO if you're in the top quartile. So going to a stop that plays to your strengths that gets you where you want to go next, thinking about that.
Yeah, that's a really fair point because we do see this correlation between strategic higher pay, functional median pay, tactical lower, but a lot of this is org size specific, and we will see functional department heads and really high performing specialist staff members at large orgs earning more than CISOs in smaller orgs. And if you're in a situation where you're feeling like you're just getting scope thrown at you, new tasks, new responsibilities, and aren't getting compensated for it, and you want to move up, the solution might not be what's the next CISO job. It might be what's a technical function that I really am ready to run at a larger org and get that exposure to a bigger business that's going to have a higher pay scale.
Yeah, it also could be what have you solved in your current company that the next organization is really struggling with? Maybe it's compliance issues, maybe it's a technical challenge, maybe it's an integration, maybe it's a migration, whatever that may be. And then, okay, you have the security credentials, but then there's also the plus plus, and then trying to find the fit to take your skill set and your toolkit and go double down in one area versus another where you could add some significant value.
Yeah, based on the question of these, are these numbers normalized across the US? This is averages of our US sample size. We tend to see, generally speaking, the regional diversity that you, or regional variation, I should say, that you would expect, in which the Northeast and the West Coast are the highest paying regions, followed by the Southeast and then the Midwest. There's a little bit more nuance to it than that, though, as we do see opportunities for folks to be, a couple of states away from a headquarters, but in a satellite office and still potentially get paid comparably to as if they were in the proximity of those headquarters. Steve, can you talk a little bit about the variations that we see regionally in CISO compensation?
Yeah, pre-COVID, certainly it was our leadership sits here. We want this person here. We'll have a very nice executive relocation package to move this person here. Great, fine, very clear. Then everybody went remote, as we all know. And then coming out of that, now we're seeing most of our clients say, We're headquartered in this region. We're in the greater DC area. Anybody on that Amtrak corridor would be good with us. We're headquartered in New York. Anybody who's Boston to Philly would be fine because we'd like them in one day a week or every other week, a couple of days, something like that. We also see certain hubs too, financial services, obviously based in New York for the most part, and then there's an outcropping in Charlotte, North Carolina, and also more and more we're seeing in Florida as well, whether it's West Palm Beach from a private equity perspective, or other parts of Florida. Similarly, on the West Coast, there are still going to be companies, and we did one of these. It was for a Series C company in the Bay Area, and they were like, "We have an in-office culture. We want people in the office 4 or 5 days a week. We have no hard and fast requirement, but that's how we work. That's how often usually everybody comes in, and it's okay. Well, then that's our target universe." Many others in the Bay Area say, "Hey, you know what? Seattle's okay, Denver's okay, Austin's okay. Let's go find the best talent. Oh, and by the way, it's probably be less expensive than the Bay Area." So depends on the organization, depends on the culture, depends on where they're going. We have seen more back to office mandates, but we've also seen some security organizations get some exemption to that, particularly for hard to recruit roles and highly specialized roles like cloud security engineering, incident response, things like that, where it's, most people are coming in 3 or 4 days a week, and somebody says, I'm willing to give you two and sometimes three, and it's okay, we really like you, we can make that work. So it does depend, but that doesn't come easy. Usually it's let's see who's willing to fit into this the schedule that we want. But there has been more flexibility around that.
Yeah, and we have some more details on this in our CISO compensation report. If you're not an IANS client and want to get the full report, ask the person who invited you. They can probably help you. But we have some state-based breakdowns in our sample. Quick methodology question. Someone asked why we are going with average instead of median. What we see in the data is median doesn't really exist much in the real world. We have a lot of people who are earning way above median and a lot of people that are earning significantly below median. We have a fairly small cohort of folks that are actually earning around median. So we find that the average figure is a better representation of the industry as a whole because it tends to show just how stratified CISO compensation is. When we report specifically on CISO compensation in our report, we do show average and median for state of CISO because we are focused on the state of the role. We are focusing on average. So if you want to see how average and median compare, you can find that in our CISO compensation report. Right now, they're about 100K apart, with median being about 100K lower than average total comp. We also see a growing trend. We see about 20% of CISOs are getting significant to all full ownership of IT. And what we see happening is as the scope increases and CISOs just get parts of IT, like say, hey, handle network infrastructure, for example, thrown onto their plate, that the compensation rewards are not really there. That often case that is orgs that just lack budget, lack people, and are having the CISOs take on more problems and more tasks because the CISOs can do it. But when CISOs are being elevated into a dual CISO and CIO role as a security leader who owns IT, the compensation benefits are very substantial, and that is actually an emerging role within the industry. Steve, can you talk about that in a little bit more depth?
Yeah, I think it's scope versus just what the intention of the organization is. Are you there to solve a problem? Are you there to save costs? Are you being asked to do these jobs because we're just in an environment being tasked to do more with less? When it's more strategic and thought out and a clear promotion, obviously we're seeing an increase in compensation. And when there's a significant title bump, okay, you're CISO and now you're CISO and head of all technology. That's different than just getting handed, okay, there's a cloud project going on. You have some of IT. So I think being thoughtful around having the conversation of why am I being asked to take this on? What's the reason behind it? Is it strategic or is it just tactical that there's nobody else? Maybe somebody left the organization and it's in an interim capacity, but then taking that challenge and saying, if I'm going to be doing this in an interim capacity, maybe I'll take it on full time and this will be part of my scope. And then you go back again and revisit your job spec and even revisit the compensation bands. It's a difficult conversation to have because I think that the information security cohort is one that we want to step up. We want to solve problems. We want to take on challenges, and you get a reputation for that, so you get more and more. But you want to get paid for that as well.
And as this continues to evolve, what shape is that really taking in terms of a future role for the CISOs? As this is emerging, are you seeing kind of a formalized title where it's CISO and CIO? Are we seeing sometimes CISO and CTO? How is that really shifting in terms of the next career step for established CISOs? And how do folks get to that if they want it?
Yeah, in our experience, if you elevate beyond the scope beyond security to take on all of IT, it's CISO slash CIO, CISO slash head of technology and security, something along those veins. And so it's not necessarily equal across all different companies, but you can tell when you start to ask about scope, and you can tell we talk about compensation and reporting lines and things like that. We have seen CISOs go into chief digitalization officers as well, continuing to go upstream, starting with tech digitalization and then more broadly across the company. There are some examples of CISOs becoming CMOs or moving over to the go-to-market side. A lot less common, but it's not like it's unheard of. So there are various ways to think about this. And so then the question becomes, well, what is your branding internally to get you where you want to go? And how does the organization view you in the lens of security, but also in the lens of the business and upward promotion potential and visibility in the org?
Great. We've got a few more questions popping in. We've got about 10 minutes left, so folks keep putting questions in. We're going to shift into Q&A mode in just a couple of minutes. Before we do, let's talk a little bit about setting yourself up for future opportunities more so than we just did. We're seeing on the whole, as CISOs get more, have the business asking for more from them, there's still not an even distribution of that. There are still CISOs who really need to kind of force their way in. We encourage folks to really work to embed themselves in the business and demonstrate and prove that value, because businesses are moving at a varied pace as to how much they are asking for the CISO. We're also seeing a growing number of CISOs starting to delegate more technical tasks and building out their leadership teams. And Steve, I wonder if you'd spend some more time there as we think about the functional leadership, the heads of architecture and engineering, the heads of GRC. What are you seeing some of the leading CISOs do to develop those folks, give them more tasks, and free themselves up to take on the more strategic role?
Yeah, it's sort of like the power of giving up power and really having the right people on your team to be able to go and execute and give you updates, and having a really well-oiled machine that you're confident that the roles get done, and you come in and you help break down barriers cross-functionally. This ties in well with what John asked in the chat, which is more about thinking about delegating to IT business units, second line of risk. A lot harder if they're not directly under your leadership. But if you are a good transformational change management communicator, you could say, look, this will help all of us if we get this from you and this from us, and here's how we go faster. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It works best when there's an alignment on priorities, which again is why you take the security initiatives and marry them up with the business objectives. And you say, hey, if we're going to meet this business objective, here's my role and here's what I'm going to do, but here's what I'm going to need from you too, because you're part of that critical path. And I think that may resonate well with organizations and with other leaders. If we both execute really well, both of our organizations and both of our functions look good.
Yeah, and that's one area where really using the boardroom relationships can help a lot too, because at the end of the day, the board is there to evaluate how well the management team is working and working together. And so, if you've got another member of the C-suite who you need to partner with on a project and get them to support you and get their teams to support you, it can be a great chance to make both of you look really good in front of the board by showing like, hey, we are partnering with the head of sales, or we are partnering with the CFO to work on this kind of project to onboard clients more successfully, or to get through purchasing more efficiently and show that we've got the security credentials. We're working cross-functionally on that. It just makes everybody look better in the boardroom. And then Steve, talk a little bit about building relationships with executive peers. How do you start to get those, not just intros, but really build meaningful, trusting relationships with executives who you might not be working directly with on a project level?
I think it's first evaluating what the current relationship level and what the reputation is of the organization and of yourself. So, do these people know who you are and know what you do? Do they respect the program? Are they a champion of the program? Are they a detractor of the program? And try to meet people where they are. Recognizing that some are just, their security is not on their radar. It's not going to be on their radar. Don't waste your time there. Go to the people who are more intellectually curious and want to know what you're working on, want to know what you're working on in the context of what they're working on, and want to know what you're working on in the context of the broader business initiatives. I think that's the best way to do it. Bringing, again, a differentiated perspective and using macro content, bringing it down to your company and then bring it down to security in a way that maybe these individuals have not thought about things, or they see a lot of noise out there on a particular topic, and you say, actually, I've been thinking about that because here's my perspective on how it impacts our company and the security implications of that. That's a really powerful way to do that.
Yeah, and then we touched on this earlier, but talk a bit more about specializing for different types of CISO role types. How is that going to help folks as the industry continues to evolve?
So I think some of this too is going to be top down too. If you have a culture that ignores security and a CEO that doesn't give security any time, it's going to be really difficult to get the ear of the general counsel and the CFO. It just is. And so be honest with yourself about what the appetite of the organization is, and try to make inroads best you can based on that. We're talking a bottoms up approach where it's you're trying to educate the people above you and find those particular people that are above you, one or two that maybe have an interest in this, and then you get top down as you get lower into their organization, introduce some people on your team to their team in a different way, and just try to be a better problem solver and a better business partner.
Right. Like, and we see that as folks do that, some will start to get a reputation as being a customer trust CISO because they're stepping in and helping with a customer facing incident. And it's going beyond just an incident response situation and more driving value through the customer response. We'll see folks become kind of getting reputations as the team building CISO because they're getting really great at keeping attrition down, retaining folks, creating development pathways, and making a team stable and successful. Finding ways to specialize can really be useful as folks look to move through their careers, simply because orgs are often looking for a specific type of CISO when they move from one to another. Steve, do you see that playing out in searches in practice?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is it's a very fluid market, and it's the CISOs are being asked to do a lot, so it's really difficult to hone in on one specific area. So just keeping your eye on where you want to go and how you could focus on more business initiatives to help get you there is will just help.
Great. So with our last few minutes, I want to do some questions in the Q&A that we haven't gotten to organically. How does one keep up with advancing technology? With all the changes in regulations, do we just keep switching off technology within the org till we have a plan to mitigate risks, or do we figure out a holistic approach?
Well, I guess this could be an opportunity for some strategic leadership and having a perspective there and saying, look, here's our technology perspective. Here's how we think about things, and just having a general thesis and finding vendors and suppliers that fit in with that thesis. But that can be really challenging. Leveraging your network, leveraging your peer group, leveraging the EINS network to get smarter as smart as you can, as quickly as you can on different platforms. And the identity access management was really important and hot, and companies like Splunk made a living off of it. And that dichotomy is changing quite a bit. How is it changing? Why is it changing? There are experts on the EINS faculty that could dive into that and help get you smarter faster.
Yeah. As the CISO role has changed, how are you seeing the path to the CISO role change? What's the path for an enterprise security architect to go through? Is it, BISO first, deputy CISO? Do you see people jumping right into CISO roles? How does that play out?
It's typically promotion every couple of years, expanded set of responsibilities, getting the technical credentials up front earlier in your career, then getting into management ranks. But I think also being clear about what you want, because we know that there are some people out there who you're a good engineer, therefore you're a good manager, and that's not always the case. You may or may not be a good manager, you may or may not want to even be a manager. And so thinking about, do you want to manage people? Do you want to drive strategic direction? Do you want to manage and drive strategic direction of technical problems or business problems? And then figuring out, well, what in the organization am I aspiring to do? Is there a path there? Make it clear that that's what you'd like to do. And if there's not, then think about going somewhere else.
All right, I'm going to take one more question, then we've got to wrap up. But folks, if we didn't get to your question, we will try to get a response via email and a follow-up. Thanks for so much engagement in the chat. It's been wonderful. Um, how do you see the market shaping up heading into 2025? We know that 75% of CISOs are open to job change. Are you expecting more activity? Are we expecting things to heat up?
I do expect more activity. I do know that there are a lot of really good people that haven't found the right role yet, so it's going to take a while for that to shake out. But I think that as organizations pay out bonuses, people get through their vesting cycles, there'll be more movement in 2025 compared to 2024. But it is going to be a bumpy ride. We're trying to figure out this new political environment. There's still some macro uncertainty, and so I wish that it was just snap your fingers and it's back to what it was a couple of years ago. It's going to take a little while for this market to unstick itself, but I think it'll come over time. And I also think that the incredibly historic low levels of attrition within security that we've seen over the last year, that's going to come home to roost at some point over the next 12 to 18 months.
Yeah, and we expect that to also be happening on the staff side, not just the CISO side, based on some of the
Correct.
preliminary findings of our staff survey. Steve, thank you so much. As always, this has been awesome.
Thanks, everybody. Great questions. Really engaging.